My name is Emily Parker, but most people just call me the Poem Girl on account of what happened to me back in 2009. I know it sounds crazy, but you've got to hear me out. This isn't some made-up ghost story. I'm telling you, what I experienced was 100% real and haunts me to this very day. It all started when I was a freshman at Oakwood University in Ohio. Being an English lit major, I was really into the dark romantic poets like Poe and Shelley. So you can imagine how stoked I was when I enrolled in Professor Sutton's famous haunted poetry seminar that delved into verse with supernatural themes and origins. Most of the class was run-of-the-mill analysis of classics like The Raven and Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. But things took a turn for the bizarre when Professor Sutton brought in a tattered, handwritten manuscript he claimed to have acquired from a private collector. He called it simply the Untitled Poem and said its backstory and contents were truly chilling if the tales were to be believed. According to the manuscript's notes, it originated in late 19th century Massachusetts. The poem itself was written by a young boy named Ethan Rodgers, who came from an extremely strict, abusive household. His parents were puritanical tyrants who lived in constant fear of the devil and subjected their children to all sorts of cruel punishments, like beatings, deprivation of food, and locking them in a cellar for days at a time. Ethan poured all his misery and suffering into this single, disturbing poem about his life being a waking nightmare, feeling trapped and tormented like he was living in hell on earth. The writing is surprisingly sophisticated for a child, with lots of occult symbolism and references to theology, the supernatural, and the underworld, almost like it was channeled from somewhere beyond this plane. Rumor has it that when Ethan's parents discovered he had written the blasphemous poem, they became convinced he was possessed by demonic forces. In one final act of depraved disciplinary action, they locked the boy in the cellar and left him there to starve to death over the course of a week, as penance for his unholy words. But the final page reveals that Ethan Rodgers cursed the poem itself on his deathbed, swearing that any person who read it aloud would become permanently haunted, tormented by the same inescapable despair, isolation, and suffering that plagued his short existence. Almost like his angry spirit would be bound to that poem for all eternity, unleashed on any foolish enough to give it voice. As Professor Sutton read out excerpts of the archaic verses, an ominous chill ran down my spine. The haunting lyrics really did seem ... wrong somehow. Unnatural, like those words should never be spoken aloud. When he finished, I noticed the rest of the class looked just as disturbed and ill at ease as I felt. Of course, a handful of didn't take the manuscript's claims seriously and began mocking the poem's backstory as some sort of dumb urban legend. One jock named Brad went so far as to snatch it off the professor's lectern and begin reading through the whole poem aloud in a mocking, dramatic voice as a joke. I'll never forget the looks of horror that drained across his face as he got about halfway through. That cavalier smirk slowly twisted in confusion, then stark terror. He began sweating profusely, his whole body trembling as his voice stammered through the remaining lines in a strained croak before trailing off into ragged, wheezing gasps. He collapsed to the floor in a quivering fetal position, eyes rolling back as he seemed to descend into some sort of catatonic stupor. A few of us tried to shake him out of it, but he was utterly unresponsive, mouth agape in a silent scream of abject horror like he had his soul shattered. The paramedics rushed him away on a stretcher, but it was already too late. We later learned the poor guy had slipped into an irreversible vegetative state. He just laid in that hospital bed for months, awake but completely vacant behind his eyes until his bodily functions eventually failed. It was like he had the life force sucked right out of him after reading that cursed poem's foul incantations. After that nightmarish incident in Professor Sutton's classroom, I became obsessed with finding out the truth behind this so-called untitled poem and its tragic origins. Was it really cursed as the manuscript claimed, or was this just an unfortunate coincidence? My curiosity quickly veered into dangerous territory. I started spending every spare moment in the university's antiquated library archives, scouring through ancient historical records and town annals from 19th century Massachusetts. It took weeks of painstaking research, but I finally managed to unearth some faded documents that corroborated core details from the poem's backstory. There were even brief mentions of a young boy named Ethan Rodgers dying under mysterious circumstances in the town of Arkham in 1892. His puritanical parents, Samuel and Abigail Rodgers, belonged to a radical sect that was repeatedly accused of extreme cruelty and abuse towards their own children in the name of harsh biblical discipline. I'll spare you the more disturbing details, but the records described rites and practices that would make even staunch fundamentalists squirm with discomfort. Let's just say the Rodgers clan seemed to take the concept of purging demonic influences from their offspring to an unthinkable, sadistic extreme. After cross-referencing the dates and locations cited, it became clear this accursed poem I held in my hands was indeed the same one attributed to poor Ethan Rodgers and his tragic life over a century ago. The way he was tormented by his own fanatic kin before wasting away, all for the crime of expressing his internal torment through poetry. It was a brutal, heartbreaking injustice that stuck with me. Even more vindicating were the strange reports of others who had encountered Ethan's untitled poem over the decades only to meet equally disturbing fates. Students and professors at elite New England universities under mental duress after private readings, collectors of occult manuscripts descending into severe psychosis or taking their own lives. The incidents were dismissed as coincidence, but the pattern was undeniable. So I made the foolish decision to obsessively study the full text of Ethan Rodgers' poem, convincing myself that understanding the nature of this curse was worth the risk of my own sanity. I mean, how could the despairing rambles of a tormented young boy from the 1800s possibly hold any literal supernatural power, right? Well, you're about to find out just how potent and pernicious poor Ethan's creation truly is. I started hearing whispers at night, like muffled voices echoing from the shadows of my apartment when I least expected it. Just incomprehensible murmurings that put me on edge. At first I dismissed it as my mind playing tricks while I spent countless hours poring over the troubling lines of that faded manuscript. But then the dreams began, if you could even call them that. More like night terrors that dragged me kicking and screaming into bleak, despairing realms that felt all too tangible. Harrowing visions of being trapped in austere chambers, walls closing in tighter with every agonizing moment, while disembodied voices chanted Ethan's poem all around me. I'd wake up drenched in cold sweat, choking back screams. From there, the haunting quickly escalated into unmistakable supernatural phenomena that I couldn't simply rationalize away. Menacing shadows would flit across my peripheral vision, only to vanish when I tried to focus on them. Strange symbols appearing scorched into my apartment walls overnight. The ubiquitous feeling of a malign presence watching me at every turn, growing stronger and more consumed with loathing by the day. Things hit a terrifying peak about a month ago when I woke up to find myself suspended horizontal in the air, every mangled line of that cursed poem etched in searing red grooves across every inch of skin all over my body, like some sort of profane ritual scarification. I've never felt pain like that in my life. Felt my psyche being unmade as some cold alien force tried to imprint itself on my very being. Since then, I can't even look at normal written text without getting vertigo, the letters contorting into the nightmarish geometries of Ethan's poem over and over, I've been suspended from classes and my family has almost committed me to intensive psychiatric treatment on several occasions, but I know that won't do any good now. This curse has taken root in my shattered mind, so I beg you, for the love of all that's holy, if you should ever encounter the writings of Ethan Rodgers, the tormented child poet of 19th century Arkham, steel your resolve and destroy them without exhibition. Purge that primordial evil from this earth before it twists and conspires to entrap another innocent soul in the same unending crucible of anguish that consumed me. Heed my warning, while your sanity remains intact,